this is the second part of a seven-part series. Each of the sections does stand on its own. So if you miss one part, like the first part, which was done last November, it's not going to be a problem for you. So with that, I'm going to start sharing my screen, and we'll start. Okay. The Gulf of Maine habitats. There's two types of habitats that exist in the Gulf and that we're going to be discussing today. The first is the physical habitat, and the other is referred to as a genetic habitat. As far as the physical habitats go, they range from rocky, sandy, and muddy, and also the water column. Okay. And as far as these habitats, they occur at all different tidal levels, like intertidal, subtidal, and also on the seabed. I wanted to make sure that this definition was known or understood by the folks online here, is that substrate is a rocky, sandy, or muddy layer on which organisms feed, grow, or live. Okay, and the substrate can vary greatly. It can range from mud to silt. You got sand, and sand has all different sizes from fine through coarse, and rock. And there's different classes of rock. You have gravel or cobble, boulders, and rocky outcrops, and bedrock. Of the physical habitats themselves are categorized by substrate type, sediment grain size, and the water depth. On the seabed itself, strong currents move sand and silt, and they leave rock, boulders, cobbles, and pebbles on the seabed. Sand and silt is moved by the current, and what it does is it accumulates in sheltered bays and in offshore basins, and many of those are rather deep. Biogenetic habitat. A biogenetic habitat is one that has structure-forming plants and animals, and that they would include salt marshes, seaweed and seagrass beds, mussel beds, and coral. With a structure-forming species, like any of those mentioned, they will modify the physical environment, and they will also form distinct eco-communities. The greater the structural diversity means that you're probably going to get more species diversity. There's an infinite variety of habitats, and each one hosts different species. And some species, like the lobster, use different habitats during their life cycle. Like when a lobster is in a larval stage, and this is a female right here with her eggs, after those eggs have hatched, the lobster's larvae will stay near the surface. When they become juvenile, they want to go down to a pebble or cobbled seabed, stony seabed. And when mature, they can tolerate many different habitats, from rocky ledges and outcrops to sand and sediment, or muddy even. And the reason why they're able to do that is they can defend themselves. I want to include this to show the examples of the lobster going through the different habitats. Up here in the top left is a larvae that is floating around. And as the larvae grows, it goes through molts, and there's 3 stages of molts. After the fourth molt, the lobster kind of looks like a tiny lobster, and it settles to the bottom. And they tend to settle to the bottom. They look for boulder reefs and cobble bottoms, because it gives them plenty of places for them to hide from predators. Interestingly enough, a legal-sized lobster, which is 1 pound, it takes about 5 to 7 years for the lobster to reach that size. A 1 pound female lobster not sure if this is 1 pound, but a 1 pound female lobster can carry 8,000 eggs. And for every 50,000 eggs that are hatched, 2 lobsters survive to legal size. And that's per NOAA. And that was when I saw that written there, I double checked it because I wanted to make sure that only 2 of them made it out of 50,000. Not much of a chance in that lottery. Looking at coastal rock substrates, at the head of the Bay of Fundy, there's a lot of conglomerate and soft sandstone. There's also mudstone there too. From west of Fundy through Massachusetts along our Maine coast, down to Cape Cod, there's granite, basalt, volcanic rock, and metamorphic bedrock that serves as a rocky substrate. When you get down to Cape Cod, there is no bedrock. Or rephrase that. The bedrock is covered by about 300 feet of sand. Metamorphic rock, like schist, and a sedimentary rock like shale underline most of the Gulf of Maine. Mostly it's schist and shale. And rocky shores with seaweed are much more productive than the open ocean, and nearly all coastal waters are. Okay, talking about the rocky shore. Invertebrates and algae live in specific zones, okay? High intertidal, you'll have barnacles. And you start going down to mid-intertidal, you'll have rockweed and blue mussels. Go down into low intertidal, you'll end up finding things like different red algae, but I'm thinking mostly of Spanish moss. Subtidally, we'll have seaweeds like kelp, lobsters, crabs, whelk, sea stars, urchins, and fish. Subtidally, you're liable to find anything that lives in the Gulf. This is a picture of a subtidal rocky substrate. It's actually a boulder reef off Cape Elizabeth. And creatures that will live here would include organisms rather that would live here would include like kelp, and this is looks like horsetail and possibly some sugar kelp. Anemones will live here, mollusk. You can see there's a slipper shell right there, and sponges. Also, you'll find lobsters, crabs, and fish. I couldn't help but notice that this starfish looks like it's waving in a very friendly manner. Deep rocky areas tend to have invertebrates and no seaweed because it goes beyond the photic zone. No light, seaweed can't photosynthesize. Here you have the up in the top left, you have the orange-footed sea cucumber. Okay, sea cucumbers are echinoderms and they're invertebrates. They are found at all depths and many of them on the deep sea floor itself. They are found on different and various bottom types with some type of substrate. Sea cucumbers tend to avoid a muddy or silty type of bottom. They eat phytoplankton and detritus, organic detritus that comes down through the water column. And interestingly enough, fishermen refer to them as pickles. And many of you look at, they kind of look that way. So some of the creatures you'd have there is obviously sea cucumbers. You have this is an orange sheet tunicate, which is considered invasive. And this is a crumb-bread sponge. You get to the deep water, the Gulf of Maine has deep sea corals, and they will grow on a rocky substrate. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about this is that these corals are growing in darkness. But if you look, they have some pretty vibrant colors up here, like the oranges and like the yellows. And you can also see down in these depths that there's some anemones and some urchins, along with this Acadian redfish. Marine life requires subtidal rock, cobble, and pebbles, and that is especially during the development. And if you note this beach here, that is the same beach as shown right here. And this is the East Point Sanctuary in Biddeford. Intertidally, Cobble and Pebble provide homes for algae, seaweed, barnacles, snails, amphipods, and isopods, two relatively small crustaceans. And the species that are present in a particular location is dependent on the wave action. The more aggressive the waves are, more likely, I'm thinking there'll be less species present because they get pushed aside and washed away. Sandy habitats. We don't have a lot of sandy habitats here in Maine, the Maine coast, but they are basically of low productivity and low diversity. And these include areas such as dunes, beaches, and sandy substrates on the sea. Fine-grained sand packs tightly. Water doesn't penetrate it as well, and it's less affected by waves and currents. Coarse-grained sand packs less tightly, and what that does is it allows for deeper water penetration. The sand itself is easier for clams and other creatures to burrow into, and it has dissolved oxygen down there that can support the life. With the fine-grained sand, while the water doesn't penetrate well, fine-grained sands would have a lot less dissolved oxygen, which would limit what could live there. Kind of example of a few of the different types of clams that you might expect to find. But one of the reasons why I want to include this picture is because it clearly shows the fact that there's two siphons for each one of these clams. And that is one of the ways that filter feeders will feed. This is a razor clam. And you notice this right here, you'll see that it is kind of at a 45-degree angle here. The clam will actually be laying flat in the beach. It'll put its foot in, and literally it will bury itself within, I want to say 15 seconds. It is really quite fast how they do that. And one of the things about razor clams is that they can actually dig deeper than most clams. They can go up to 2.5 to 3 feet deep. And in Oregon, they can even go as much as 4 feet deep. And I'm thinking, how does something dig so fast? Well, what it does is this is the process. It places the razor clam will put its foot in sand, and it constricts a valve inside the shell that causes a vacuum. And what happens is that vacuum makes like a localized quicksand effect in the sand below it. And then the clam dives in and it expels excess sand out one of its siphons. But this is something worth Googling because it's so fast. This is how fast one of these guys can bury themselves. The quahog. The scientific name is Mercenera mercenaria, and it's derived from the Latin term for money. And I think that probably comes about because Native Americans made beads used as wampum, and they were considered trade goods. Quahogs themselves like a sandy to muddy habitat. They can be intertidal to 60 feet deep. Excuse me, yeah, 60 in water 60 feet deep. And they can live 200 years. And some of the oldest, actually the oldest that they've noted is 507 years old. And the age of a quahog or a clam can be found by counting the rings that are on the shell. Interesting thing about quahogs is this. A couple of years ago, Woods Hole did a study, and they used quahog shells. And what they found is that the oxygen and nitrogen and isotopes that are in the shells tell what was going on at the climate in that time period. And one of the things that they've determined is in the last 1,000 years, for 900 years, the Gulf of Maine was in a cooling mode. But within the last 100 years or so, it started warming up. And that is evidenced by what they found with in the study of the shells, but also in models, computer models that they had set up. That warming itself began in the late 1800s, about 50 years after the start of the Industrial Revolution. And one of the things that they think that there's the cooling of the first 900 years of this that they studied was likely driven by volcanic activity and the ocean currents in the Atlantic. Myofauna. Myofauna is microscopic fungi, bacteria, and other microorganisms. They live between the grains of sand and mud. And 40% of the volume of a beach beach sand is space. One of the reasons why there is that volume there is because beach sand tends to be rounded, and therefore it doesn't pack together as tightly, and it has those spaces in there. Myofauna is a food source. They're really at the very bottom of the food pyramid. They're eaten by other myofauna and maybe some other larger creatures too. They promote beach regeneration. About 50%, if not more, have tissue that hardens through biomineralization. And when they die, their outside skeletons will end up dropping and ending up helping to replenish the beach. Most myofauna live within a 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch of the surface, and they're very sensitive to pollution. One of the things I think is interesting about myofauna is oftentimes when we look at a beach and you look at the expanse of sand, you think that there's nothing there. But even so, there's myofauna and clams, and there's a lot that's going on under the sand. Myofauna are organisms that are classified by size, not taxonomy. And you have nematodes, like these worm-like structures, one of the types of myofauna. And the other is copepods. Excuse me, the other is copepods, right here. Copepods are referred to as the cows of the sea, an herbivore. The rackline. This is the highest extent of the waves, and it provides both food and habitat. And if you got a chance to go to the beach, even in winter, if you kick up some of the rackline, you're liable to see a bunch of fleas, sand fleas, and other insects moving around. Well, the rackline, provides the food and habitat for those creatures, but also when the rackline breaks down, it tends to replenish the beach. With a subtidal sandy habitat, few organisms live above the seabed. The ones that you'll find living in a sandy habitat are moon snails, a large snail, about 1.5 inches, and I think they get about an inch and a half in diameter. Whelks and sand dollars. They bury themselves in the sand, even though this picture of sand dollars shows them above the sand right here. Flounder, skates, and shrimp use camouflage when they're on the seabed. And this, if you look at the flounder here, you can see it pretty much matches the somewhat muddy bottom that it's on. In some cases, you look at the camouflage and it looks almost perfect in terms of how it blends in. You have subtidal gravelly bottoms. And on this type of bottom, you're going to find stuff like anemones. Like this is a anemone, a spiny sea star, and there's another sea star there. And this fish is a sculpin, common fish in the Gulf. Moving on to muddy habitats. Muddy habitats have fine, silty sediments. The grain size varies. They can go from pure silt, very, very fine, to a clay sand mixture, having a bigger grain size there. Muddy habitats tend to occur when the sea is calm or sheltered. So it has to be in a calm and sheltered tidal or subtidal area. On a muddy habitat, there'll be no vegetation at all, or very sparsely, you might see some seaweeds or algae here and there. The intertidal mudflat habitat is quite, to me, quite interesting. Approximately 1,000 species of macroinvertebrates live in mudflats. And by a macroinvertebrate, I mean anything that you can see with the naked eye. Don't need a microscope or magnifying glass to see it. Most live within 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch deep in the mud. They live in burrows or use siphons and tubes to get their food and oxygen, I should say, and they tend to filter feed. Oftentimes, these mud flats will occur next to salt marshes and eelgrass beds. And salt marshes also require a relatively calm and protected environment to develop. These are some pictures, and actually I did include this one here showing some clams, but also you have these burrowing organisms here. And what they will do is as they're burrowing, they are going and they are working the bottom up, and it helps to push nutrients and dissolved oxygen into the seabed. Particle feeders, okay? There's two types of particle feeders, suspension and deposit. A suspension feeder obtains its food from particles in the water, and they filter feed either actively or passively. And you have some examples of suspension feeders of sponge, clams, different other creatures here. Here you're pumping and you're actively pumping the water through the system so it can be filtered out. Over on the passive suspension, the creatures put their silica out and they will capture whatever falls on them. The other type of particle feeder is a deposit feeder, and deposit feeders obtain food from particles on the bottom. And what they do is they ingest the sediment and extract the food. And this burrow shows how they will pull the water in, and then out here they will push the what they've digested and their waste products out the other end of the burrow. Subtidal muddy areas are generally inhabited by invertebrates and fish. Soft sediment inhabitants include horseshoe crabs, mud snails, skates, like this one here, and flatfish. Also, there's some anemones that will grow in a muddy environment. The water column is the largest habitat in the Gulf of Maine, and it lies between the seafloor and the surface. The water column has distinct layers, and they are separated by temperatures, salinity, and density. And density and salinity are somewhat related because more salt means it's more dense. Productivity in the water column is determined by nutrient upwellings. The currents will push water past an island or an inlet, and what it does is it tends to cause nutrients to come towards the surface. One of the things about the water column is it has thermal habitats, and that is the amount of water in a given temperature range. And that habitat is determined by the currents and the water temperature. And this is a cod right here, and cod tend to like cold water. In the water column, would like to talk about the photic zone. And the photic zone is the surface to the depth that sunlight penetrates. Phytoplankton, plants, like microalgae and cyanobacteria, they photosynthesize to produce food. They live in the photic zone because they need the sun. And phytoplankton is the basis of the food web in the ocean. Zooplankton, animals, and they include herbivores and carnivores. They are mesopelagic. They live from the bottom of the photic zone to about 1 kilometer under the sea. Many of zooplankton migrate to the surface nightly to feed. They do not spend the daylight hours up near the surface to avoid predation and also damage from UV rays. This is a picture of a school of herring and the Scudic ridges, and I included it because the herring are here, but also there is a fair amount of deep sea coral. This is a school of cod, and if you'll notice, they have this little, like, I'm going to call it a protrusion. I guess the technical word would be would be a fleshy protrusion, and that's called a babo. And that's how you can tell that it's a cod because it has that hanging off its lower lip. Another fish I'd like to mention is the sand lance. Sand lances prefer a sandy bottom less than 300 feet deep. They grow 3 to 6 inches long. They eat zooplankton, and at night they bury themselves in the sand. And you can see that they are pretty much as glistening as the sand is there. This is a humpback whale, and what it's doing is it's draining water from its mouth, filtering sand lances that it's wanting to eat. A humpback whale is a rorqual whale, and you've probably seen pictures of a whale that looks like, they've got a big bulge under their throat. What happens is when the humpback decides it wants to eat, it will go through, it will fill that whole throat pouch filled with water and hopefully sand lances or whatever they're going after to eat. And then what they will do is they will close their mouth and use their tongue to push the water out between the baleen. The humpback whales have I think, a pretty interesting way to catch the fish, the sand lances. And what they do is they make a bubble net. They start spiraling upward, releasing bubbles. And you can see on this photo that the bubbles have been released at different depths. And what happens is that those bubbles come to the surface and it traps the sand lances into a smaller area. So then the humpback whale can just go in and scoop them up easier. I included this because you can see the baleen really well here. It's just fine, almost like hairs that filter the food out. In the Gulf of Maine itself, there are, excuse me, humpback, fin, minke, and North Atlantic right whales. There are other types of whales that might come in, and it's also like dolphins and porpoises, but these are the four major whale types. The fin whale is the second largest whale in the world after the blue whale. Minke is a relatively small whale, and you've got the North Atlantic right whales, which are very much endangered. There's 380 of them. It's the last census. I wanted to include this because it shows the the lines on the underside of the whale's throat. And this is the area that when the whale is swimming underwater, it will fill and there'll be a huge bulge, and that's what he pushes that water out against the baleen. I had to include this because I just like the look of this laughing gull. He looks so nonchalant as he's munching down on that sand lance. All right, biogenetic habitats. Biogenetic habitats have structure-forming plants and animals. Examples, salt marsh, seagrass beds, kelp beds, other seaweed beds, shellfish beds, cold water corals. These structure-forming species can modify their physical environment, and therefore they end up forming distinct eco-communities. Start with the first, one of my favorites, the salt marsh. Salt marshes are very important for a number of reasons, but in terms of habitat, they're a great habitat for birds and fish. And there's an example here of there's an embryotic fish here. These are mummichugs that live like in the marsh or in salt pans in the marsh, and a sickleback. It's important to think about this is that 75% of the commercial and recreational fish that we seek as a society spend some or all of their life in the marsh itself. And other fish like winter flounder, while they spend their young years in the salt marsh, when it comes colder weather, they will tend to go to harbors and salt marshes to be there for the winter. The salt marshes themselves are critical habitat. Migrating birds need them to rest and feed. In some cases, those birds might be coming up to raise their chicks up here. So it's a nursery for birds and fish. And also with the fact that this is on a salt marsh is generally on a river, the fish might be swimming upstream to spawn, and those are aragonous fish. This is a picture of the Scarborough Marsh. And Scarborough Marsh is the largest marsh in the state, and it's about 1,300 acres. And this is actually the eastern part of the Eastern Trail that goes over the marsh. Eelgrass. Eelgrass photosynthesizes, and it provides food and habitat. Pieces of eelgrass will break off, and fish and crabs and invertebrates will eat it. In Casco Bay, between the years 2018 and 2022, there was a 54% reduction in eelgrass meadows. And some of the reasons for that decline, and they haven't nailed it all down, but these are the likely candidates: warming water, algal blooms that reduce the sunlight, because these grasses need sunlight to photosynthesize. Green crabs, again, the young will eat the eelgrass, they'll snip it off right at the base, while the mature green crabs will disrupt the roots when they're digging and looking for prey. And I think it's quite interesting here if you go to the 2001, 2002, you had over 8,000 acres. And by 2022, you only had about 2,300 acres. So there's a significant decline in 22 years also. Pipefish live in eelgrass beds. They can grow 4 to 8 inches long, and sometimes it can get up to 12 inches long. They tend to like marshes and river mouths, safe places to live. The loss of seagrass has caused the population of pipefish to go down. And up here is a pipefish, and it's a male pipefish, and this is his brood pouch. And what happens with pipefish, similar to seahorses in this case, is that the pipefish will go through and it'll open its brood pouch, the female will deposit her eggs, and then the male will fertilize the eggs within the brood pouch, and the babies will actually be born, and they'll be ready to swim the minute they're born, they're hatched. This is a last picture of a pipefish. You can see how well they camouflage within the seaweed that they're growing next to. Blue mussels. Blue mussels are a keystone species. A keystone species means it's the one that has to be there for the environment or the habitat to work. They blue mussels filter feed and they remove pollutants. They provide food and habitat also. In the past 40 years, there's been a 60% decline of the blue mussels in the intertidal area. It used to be 40 years ago, 60% of that intertidal area was covered. Today, it's about 10%. So serious decline in blue mussels. Again, potential causes: higher temperatures, water chemistry, acidification, and predation. Acidification, oceans are getting more acidic. Predation, you have green crabs to thank for that. The mussels themselves grow attached to the rock, and this picture on the right shows the byssus, or the filaments that they send out and attach themselves to the substrate too. And interestingly enough, scientists have studying the byssus and how the mussel is able to attach itself, and they've actually used it to develop different types of super glue. Kelp beds provide food and shelter. Again, kelp beds, seaweed. You can see here that it's pretty dense in terms of the foliage itself. But if you go down to and look at the bottom of the holdfast, you'll see that they look like a bunch of, they do resemble roots, but they're not. But how they attach to the substrate, and there's a lot of spaces in here for creatures like small crabs, shrimp, anything that can fit in there to live and be protected. Kelp farming. It's kind of big in Maine. Kelp grows from fall to spring, and it's harvested between April and June. Maine is the largest U.S. producer of kelp, and in 2022, nearly 1 million pounds was harvested and sold. Kelp farm absorb excess nutrients and carbon dioxide. They improve the water quality, and they're also beneficial to fisheries, especially shellfish. A couple of years ago, a study was done, and between fronds of kelp, they had mussels, blue mussels growing. They found that the mussels tended to grow better because the kelp tended to made a halo effect and made the water surrounding them a little bit less acidic so that the mussels would do well. Deep sea corals, they grow slowly at a depth of 150 feet or more. One of the reasons why, like dragging and knowing, if you're a fisherman with a dragger, why they would need to know what's down there is that if you ran a dragger across the seabed and it had deep sea corals, they wouldn't be there any longer. These corals can live centuries. They prefer a hard bottom, hard substrate. They're suspension feeders, as we discussed a little earlier. detritus and organic particles will fall down onto the coral, and they'll have silica that will move the food towards their mouths, into their mouths. These they don't require sunlight because they're so deep. And again, they do provide shelter and hiding places. And you can see that there are looks like some shrimp in this picture. And there's one also. He's pretty well camouflaged there. Again, I can't help but note the colors that these corals and the anemone have, considering that they're in a dark spot. This is another picture of deep sea corals. And this is actually another. Interestingly enough, the corals themselves, they don't have to be on a flat surface. They will also often tend to grow on vertical type surfaces. And this is the only octopus that lives in the Gulf of Maine. And I don't mean this one individual, but it's the only species. It's a deep water native to the Gulf, and it's about 2.5 to 5 inches long. I believe. Okay, to conclude, the physical habitats, you have rocky, sandy, muddy, and the water column. Biogenic habitats, marshes, kelp and seagrass beds, mussel beds, and also deep sea corals. So with that, are there any questions?
Steve, do you know if there's any research or studies showing migration of the biogenic habitat north, going farther and farther north as temperatures in the waters are warming?
I don't know that has been studied, but I know that there are other species like the black sea bass that are moving up this way. And in time, I'm thinking that it could, what you're saying could happen, and they might be able to study it and know how much it has happened. But at this point, I don't believe they have anything like that.
Thanks.
And folks, feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question like Gary did, or if you're more comfortable, you can type your question in the chat.
I have,
Go ahead, Peter.
I have a question. Steve, when we went to the Great Bay estuary, we noticed a lot of attention there for horseshoe crabs. And I wonder what happened to the horseshoe crabs on the Maine beaches. When I was a kid, I used to see hundreds of horseshoe crabs at Wells Beach.
Really? At this point, and it's interesting you say that, Peter, because I really don't know of any place in Maine where there are horseshoe crabs. We went down to the Great Bay estuary and saw them. I know that there are problems with the horseshoe crab population because they're harvested because they want the blood so that they can use it. It's blue blood and it has an antigen in it that will tell them if a vaccine or some sort of a medical compilation is safe. And they also use them for bait. What's happened is it used to be that Delaware was a big spot for the horseshoe crabs. And then what happened is that they moved to, because that fishery became kind of iffy, the focus of it moved to Cape Cod. And what they're finding is that there's probably more horseshoe crabs taken than should be. They're overfished. And one of the things about that is that the companies that do the horseshoe crab bleeding say that there's a 20% mortality rate, but it's suspected that the mortality rate is significantly higher than that. And of these 5 companies, none of them have a hard record of how many died after they bled them. So they're becoming, and actually they're in the Cape Cod, which is a major stopover for red knots, a type of sandpiper. They're finding that the red knot population is going down. One of the reasons that they think that is that the food, like at Cape Cod, the horseshoe crabs, because they eat the eggs, is going down. Fewer crabs, less eggs, fewer crabs, same with the eggs and the predators.
Thank you, Steve. I'd just like to comment. My question was not part of your prepared talk today, and I am just continually astounded by the wealth of specific information that you have in your head. It's just truly amazing, and thank you so much for sharing it.
Yeah. I should say this, you're embarrassing the daylights out of me,
Good.
but don't stop.
Applause.
But thank you for the vote of confidence. Yeah. And I will say this, and Peter's a docent also. The whole topic of what's going on in the oceans is pretty interesting. And it seems that just about every week there's another big headline, about example, the eelgrass or some other issue that's going on in the Gulf. So, or oceans worldwide. Hey, Norma.
Just to your point about how much
Oh, geez.
when you made the comment about how the Scarborough Marsh is the largest marsh,
Yeah.
it got even bigger. You mentioned pictures in the paper, or news in the paper. If you saw this morning's Herald, and the picture of how the marsh really overflowed in yesterday's storm.
Did it flood? It must have flooded the roadway too.
It did. Yeah.
Yeah, it was. I had to go to Scarborough, and I went to Turnpike, but coming back on Route 1, I had to do a detour. There was a big dump truck parked in the middle of the road, thinking they don't want you to go down there.
Has that marsh been overflowing a lot, or more and more in the past several years? Or is this one the worst?
When I ride through that, and if anybody's not familiar with this, Route 1 literally goes through the marsh. And I know that they're talking about raising that section of Route 1 about 3 feet. And I don't know what their time plan for that is, but the DOT has mentioned that. Another thing about that is going by, pay particular attention to sea level and how high the water is. There's been a number of times that I've gone by there that the water, while there hasn't been a storm or an event that would make you think, oh, there's supposed to be a lot of water here, the water comes relatively close to the road. And the other thing about it is there's a lot of Phragmites there. Up along that Route 1 corridor. So it's got a lot of negatives going for it in terms of the future.